thank you everybody for being here. I think that yes. It's an honor for me to introduce you our speaker of today. He's Bill Morris, and I learned about his work long time ago before I really started modeling networks. I really enjoyed reading his papers in pollination biology, and he developed great functional responses on pollination. So that's how it started. So that's why I'm so happy to invite him here. He describes himself as a population biologist that uses quantitative tools. His background is as a biologist, but during his PhD, he studied math. So it's an interesting other way to get to do theory also in ecology. So he got his PhD at the University of Washington in 1990, and he's been in Duke University since 1992 as a professor there. So thank you for being here, Bill.
Okay, just let me get the technology set up here. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it recording, we hope? Okay, I want to talk today about population responses to climate change. And we all know this graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicting warming of the global climate. And this raises some important challenges for conservation biologists. We need to try to predict which species are going to be able to persist in the face of this climate warming and which ones will be threatened with extinction unless we intervene. But species can persist in two different ways. They could shift their locations in order to track the climate conditions that they can tolerate, or they could stay in place if they have enough plasticity to tolerate the new conditions, or if they can evolve climate adaptation. So here's examples of each of those responses. So this is historical data from spruce pollen. We all know spruce was much farther south during the peak of the Pleistocene in order to avoid the ice sheet, and it's moved farther north back up into Canada as the climate has warmed. So it's not at all found where it was during the peak of the Pleistocene. Here's a more recent example that suggests in this paper by Parmesan et al. That this particular butterfly has shifted its range north in the Nordic countries. The green area is added on. But although there's been some turnover in the south, there's been no net loss of the southern populations in northern Africa. So this may be a population that's static in the south to climate change. So our philosophy in this research is that we need to understand in a mechanistic way what determines particularly the population limits, the range limits of species, the demographic things that determine why will a species be found in a certain place and how can it have a static range limit, because typically it's at the range limits that species shift either north or south. And when I say we, I mean my collaborator and I for this long-term study, who's Dan Doak from the University of Colorado now. And you can see I haven't labeled who is who in this picture because everyone confuses us. The work I'm going to talk to you is funded on several NSF programs to encourage long-term research. And so this is me on the left, and that's Dan on the right, now at the University of Colorado. And this just shows the effects of long-term research on the researchers. So the work I'm going to tell you about is we've been doing for more than 20 years now. And this is our 10-year anniversary in 2005. And here's our 20-year anniversary of collecting data, the data that I will tell you about today. So we've been studying two species of tundra plants throughout their geographical ranges in North America. The first one is the moss campion, Silene caulis. It looks kind of like a moss when it's not in flower, but it's a member of the pink family, Caryophyllaceae. It's a cushion plant, so it has this morphology that many alpine plants have evolved of remaining low, close to the ground in the Earth's boundary layer, where wind is a little lower, temperatures are a little higher, and they can exploit that slightly higher temperature for growing in extreme environments. Just to say a little more about this plant, this is a moss campion plant that I encountered just after a grizzly bear had overturned it for some reason. I don't know why they do that, maybe to look for things to eat underneath it, but it nicely illustrates that these cushions have a single taproot that grows into the ground. So each cushion is a genetic, distinct individual, and so we can follow individual plants, which is convenient for a population study. We also study a second species of tundra plant, which is the Alpine Distort, and this one has an interesting breeding system. So although the flowering stalks will often have flowers on the end, they'll also have these little asexual bulbils, which are essentially like a little onion that's a clone of the parent plant. Many plants like these produce no flowers at all. And interestingly, the flowers essentially never make seeds. So essentially all the reproduction is through these clones, the bulbils, that fall off, root, and create a new independent plant that's genetically identical to the mother plant. So why did we pick tundra plants? Several reasons. They could be good indicators of the biological consequences of climate warming because they're evolved to do well in cold environments. So they might be good canaries in a coal mine for the biological effects of warming. At the same time, some amount of warming typically benefits tundra plants, so they can exploit somewhat warmer conditions, but too much warming may be bad for them. They're shade intolerant, so one possibility is that climate change will affect them indirectly by favoring the growth of neighboring plants that might overtop them and shade them out. Certainly they will not persist as tree line goes up, and they won't persist underneath trees. And as I'll show you, they have very broad latitudinal ranges, so we can ask questions about how they maintain their broad geographical ranges. They're also, moss campion, for example, both of these species are panboreal, so they're found throughout Siberia as well. Okay, so we started a demographic study of both plants in 2001, and we established replicate populations, 4 or 5 populations of each of the species at 4 different locations spanning the latitudinal range in the western United States, from far northern Alaska at Toolik Lake, which is a long-term ecological research site run by the University of Alaska, and all the way down to Niwot Ridge, which is another LTER site run by University of Colorado. And you can see as we go further south, we are going higher and higher in elevation, so the colors indicate elevation. The white down here is, I think, anything above 2,000 meters of elevation. So as we go to the southern range limit, we're also going higher and higher in elevation, as is typical for tundra plants. So the southern range limit is in northern New Mexico for both of these plants. What we're really interested in is what's going to happen to the southern range limit as climate changes. We're not so interested in the northern range limit, which is the Arctic Ocean. They basically already reached the Arctic Ocean, so they don't have anywhere to go. So we're mostly interested in what's going to happen to the southern range limit. Okay, I just want to show you some pictures of all these sites just to see the diversity of places that this plant grows. So this is Toolik Lake, right after we arrived there in early August of 2002. It snowed 8 inches. These plants are only this high, so we had to wait a few days until the snow melted so we could measure them. So that just says this growing season could be quite short at the northern end of the range. This is another picture from Toolik Lake, now looking south towards that northern range of mountains, the Brooks Range in Alaska. Open, treeless tundra, a really beautiful area. So this is largely just for me to show you nice, pretty pictures of places that these plants grow. Now we're moving to south central Alaska to the Wrangell Mountains. So this is an area of tall volcanoes. We have trees at lower elevations, but then we have tundra at higher elevations where both of these plants will be found. This is a really gratuitous picture, just to show you beautiful places. But on the sides of the large glaciers, you'll find tundra where both of these plants are found. Moving further south, this is the Banff National Park in Canada. Again, our study sites are up above the tree line. You can see the highway down there. And then finally, at 3,600 meters in Colorado at Niwot Ridge is our southernmost population. So what we've done since 2001 is visit each of these locations and follow the fates of marked individuals of both species. So we set out transects in the first year. We marked all individuals of whichever species we were studying at that site. Each year we go back, we can say which plants survived 1 year to the next census. We measure the plant size, so we measure the growth of individual plants. For the moss campion, that's quite easy because it's essentially a two-dimensional plant, so we just have to estimate the two-dimensional area of the plant. We count the fruits which are retained on the plant until the end of the growing season, so we get total annual seed production. And finally, to close the demographic loop, we follow the number of new seedlings and small plants that appear. So here you can see a mother plant, and you can see these colored toothpicks that we follow individual seedlings. So we get the rate at which the seeds produced by this plant last year recruit into new seedlings in the population, and how many of those seedlings survive to become independent plants in the population. So it's basic demographic work over a large geographical scale. So now, as I said, we're interested in what sets the southern range limit. Demographically, what is the mechanism that sets the southern range limit, and what will that range limit do as the climate warms? So the simple expectation we might have for what demographically happens at a range limit. So again, we're interested in this southern range limit here. As we approach that range limit, the simple classical model might predict that the rate of birth declines as we approach that range limit. The rate of death or loss of individuals from the population increases until we reach the point where those things are equal, and beyond that point, we can't recruit enough new individuals to replace deaths of existing individuals, and population, if it were able to establish, would decline. So that's the simplest expectation of what we should expect demographically as we approach a range limit, but this is too simple in at least 3 different ways. First of all, the rate at which individual plants grow, not just how fast they reproduce and how well they survive, but how fast they reach reproductive size is also important. If they reach reproductive size quickly, populations will be more easily maintained than if they reach reproductive size slowly. Secondly, not all demographic processes must necessarily deteriorate as we reach a range limit. The limit may be set more by some balance of rates that are deteriorating and rates that might actually be improving or showing no change. And finally, that simple graph of the mean survival and birth rate is ignoring the fact that those things vary from year to year, and the variability in demographic processes can have distinct effects on population growth, distinct from the effects of the mean of those demographic processes. So we want to look at how variability in demographic rates changes as we approach the range limit as well. So this is the first data slide that I'm going to show you in this same format. So here we're showing for the 2 species, the moss campion and the Alpine Distort. Now we're showing mean annual survival. So over 5 years on average, how high was the survival rate? And in all cases, this is kilometers north of the equator. So these are our northern sites, and this is the southern range limit. So what you can see in this graph is for the moss campion, I've broken them down into 3 different size classes, large, medium, and small. For all size classes, there is what we would expect from the classical model of range limit, a reduction in the survival rate as we approach the southern range limit. This let me just point out that this is a logit scale. So the reduction in survival of large plants, although significant, is a small change. But notice how high these survival rates are. We're going from something like 99.5% annual survival to 99% annual survival. So these are extremely long-lived plants. Although they're no bigger than a dinner plate, they're very long-lived perennial plants. The most dramatic change, magnitude-wise, is in the reduction in survival of the very smallest plants. So they show the sharpest reduction as we approach the southern range limit, going from something like 80% annual survival to 60% annual survival. Still remarkably high for those tiny little plants. 60% of them survive an average year. For the Distort, only the medium-sized class shows the significant decline. But again, it's the decline we would expect in a sort of classical model. Things are getting worse as we approach the southern range limit. Now let's look at rates that affect recruitment of new individuals to the population. Fruit production for the moss campion, the production of these bulbils, these asexual units for the Distort. Again, when there's a pattern, it's the pattern of declining performance as we approach the southern range limit that we might expect. For the moss campion, we have two rates of seedling recruitment because they recruit 1 year and 2 years later from the seeds. There's a short-lived seed bank. And both of those show declining rates as we approach the southern range limit. However, when we look at the growth rate of those individuals that survive, we see the opposite pattern. Instead of declining towards the southern range limit, the growth of individual plants is actually, particularly the small plants that had the strongest reduction in survival approaching the southern limit, show the strongest increase in growth as we approach the southern limit in the moss campion. And for all the three size classes of the Distort, there's a significant increase in the rate at which surviving plants grow as we approach the southern range limit. So this is working in opposition to the declining rate of survival and recruitment of new individuals in the population. So what we've been calling this is demographic compensation. To some extent, the rates that are improving as we approach a range limit are compensating for the rates that are declining. And together, these rates have to be integrated to ask what determines the range limit. If you think about it, if some environmental condition is deteriorating and some rate is declining, other rates must improve if you're going to find the plant across this geographical range. So this demographic compensation is likely to be a common phenomenon in plant populations and maybe other populations. We looked a little bit at how common that might be by going to the literature and looking at other plant demographic studies that have involved 6 or more populations. And so the signature of demographic compensation is some negative correlation between two vital rates, like survival rate declining and growth rate increasing. So we looked at how often are these vital rates, survival, growth, reproduction, or shrinkage, another vital rate, how often are they negatively correlated? And are they more so than if we just randomize the association between rates in the studies? And 40% of those studies showed a higher frequency of negative correlations than we might expect by chance, suggesting that this demographic compensation may be common in those studies, particularly studies that span the entire range, so span the whole environmental range that a species is found in. All of those studies showed more negative correlations between demographic rates than we might expect by chance. This graph is just showing that when there were negative correlations, they were more likely to be between different kinds of demographic rates. For example, I showed you there was a negative correlation between survival rate and growth rate. We could also ask, are the survival rates of different life stages in the population correlated negatively? Less likely to be so. Most likely these negative correlations arise between different kinds of demographic processes, between survival and growth, survival and reproduction. So maybe there's something about the control of those different life history events that allows them to respond in opposite ways to environmental variation. Okay, so but why is this happening? Why are the southern populations growing faster than the northern populations? They're surviving less well. That's not so surprising because we're approaching a range limit. Why are they growing more? So to look at that, we've looked at some climate variables. One is the length of the snow-free period. So how much time do they have to grow? And we got this initially from satellite data. So this is MODIS satellite data that shows you on this particular day what parts of the Earth were covered with snow, the red areas. So we could go to the locations of our populations, determine when the snow disappeared in the spring, when it returned in the fall, and know the length of the growing period for each region. We also got climate data from climate stations or weather stations nearest to the sites and asked what the temperature was at the individual sites. So here's, again, our 4 sites from Niwot region, red at the south, to Tule Lake in blue at the north. And you can see that although we're going to higher and higher elevations as we go south, we're actually getting warmer conditions during July. So in Colorado, the July temperature is actually warmer, despite it being higher. And the time of snow-free growth period is longer. So what this suggests is that if you can survive in the south, you actually have a longer growing period, warmer conditions during that growing period, and you can grow faster than you could if you were farther north. What we do now is we measure temperature directly at the site where individual plants are growing with eye buttons. I'm sure many of you have used eye buttons. Have any of you used eye buttons? I thought so. They're getting really common in ecology. So they're small. They look like a small camera battery, but they're a small thermistor that will record temperature for up to a year. And so we bury them shallowly at the site that the plants are growing. We only go to these sites once a year. We bury these and we have them record the temperature. And this can give us both the temperature during the growing season and the length of the snow-free period. So here's 2 different eye button records. This is one from Colorado. And what you can see is that there's the daily oscillation in temperature, and that continues all the way through the winter and back to the spring. In this population in latitude 61 in Alaska, you can see in the fall the daily oscillation, and then it stops once snow is covering the eye button. It slowly gets colder, but no daily oscillation. And then we can see when the snow disappears in the spring and the daily oscillation begins. So we can get both snow-free period and temperature during the growing season when the temperature is oscillating. And so just to show you some data from that, again, the mean temperature during the growing season measured at the site of the plants is in fact higher at the southern populations. These are now latitude for both species, so that gives them more chance to grow with warmer temperatures. The maximum temperature is higher, which could eventually be a problem. This is the days without snow cover. I'm sorry, days with snow cover. So what you can see is that Colorado population actually has few days with snow cover. I showed you that record that showed no sign of snow coverage. As a consequence of that, no snow cover, they experience more days with extremely cold temperatures below 15 degrees centigrade. In 40 degrees latitude, there were more days, more extremely cold days than there were at 69 degrees north latitude, because in the north slope of Alaska, they're almost always covered with snow. And that's not because that's a very snowy place. In fact, once the Arctic Ocean freezes over, there's no source of snow for the north slope. It's actually a fairly dry place in winter. So what we find there is the populations they seem to be in very sheltered places where, say, in the lee of a small ridge where the snow likely comes very early and covers the plants for most of the winter, so long period of snow cover, low chance that they're going to experience extremely low temperatures. That's less so of the Distort, less snow cover, and lots of days with very cold temperature. The Distort actually dies back completely to a starchy root below ground. The moss campion keeps its growing meristems above ground. It may be more sensitive to the effects of very cold freezing temperatures than the Distort, and that's what this seems to be suggesting. This is what can happen to the moss campion when it experiences frost conditions. The next year we can see parts of the plant have died back because they've experienced frost damage. So that could be that the change in precipitation patterns, change in snow cover due to climate change causing changes in precipitation in winter, might actually have negative effects on these plants, distinct from the effects of climate warming. We also asked whether these negative correlations would hold up if we went even closer to the southern range limit of these plants. So in 2007 or so, we abandoned our Banff National Park populations and added new populations in northern New Mexico, right at as close as we could find reasonably abundant populations near the actual southern range limit. And this is data from those new populations. So again, we see as we go to hotter and drier conditions, the growth rate is increasing. So as we go from north to south, growth is increasing opposite to what we might expect. These new populations show the highest growth rate of all, right at the southern range limit. And they show the same declining pattern of survival, and in fact the lowest survival of all. So this corroborates, even as we get closer to the range limit, that there's these negative correlations between the demographic processes. So I mentioned that the third thing we have to consider is the possibility that there are differences in the variability, the year-to-year variation in vital rates or demographic rates in the population. And just to show why that's important, I wanted to quickly review the simplest population model that allows for stochastic variation or random variation in the birth and death rates. So here we have, we're going to try to predict the number of individuals in the population next year, year t plus 1, starting from the number of individuals this year times the per capita population growth rate, lambda, which is subscripted by t because it's going to vary from year to year. So in years where there's more births than deaths, this per capita multiplication rate is greater than 1 and the population grows. In years where births are less than deaths, lambda is less than 1, the population declines. And so we can simulate environmental stochasticity by keeping the average population growth rate fixed, but just varying the year-to-year variation in population growth rates. And so here's a simple simulation where in all cases the arithmetic mean of this population growth rate is the same, 1.02. We would expect 2% annual growth of the population. This is a log scale, so this is with no variation. It looks like just linear growth on the log scale, exponential population growth. As we now vary this population growth rate year to year, keeping the arithmetic average fixed, of course now there's multiple trajectories that the population could follow because we're randomly choosing a population growth rate every year. It's a little hard to see what the mean behavior is here, but if I crank up the variation even more, I think you can see now, in addition to greater scatter, a net tendency for these trajectories to decline. And that's driven only by the variance, right? Because I've kept the arithmetic mean the same. And this is something all population ecologists know, because the long-term growth rate of the population is governed not by the arithmetic mean, but by the geometric mean, a measure of the multiplicative effect of population growth rates over all the years. The geometric mean is affected negatively by increased variance. So as we increase the variation year to year in the demographic rates of birth and death, we're going to depress the long-term population growth rate. So that suggests that in addition to changes in the average rates as we approach a range limit, we have to worry about the possibility that the variation year to year in the rates of birth and death and growth and all the demographic processes could be changing as we approach a range limit. So we looked at that with our, so this is a sort of modification of the classical model where now we're saying as we approach a range limit, the averages of the rates of survival, reproduction, and growth may be declining, but the variability from year to year may be increasing, and together these two effects on the mean and the variance are setting a range limit. So we looked at the variability of rates over years as a function, again, of the distance from the equator or position in the latitudinal range. For the Moss Campion, there's variation in the variation among populations, right? So this is how much difference is there between good and bad years. That variability is different between different populations at a certain latitude, but there's no trend in variability with latitude. In consequence, the variability in fruit production rate increases as we approach the southern range limit. So that means near the southern range limit, there's greater contrast between good years for fruit production and bad years. Further north, there's more like similar fruit production every year. And as we saw, increased variance could reduce the long-term geometric mean population growth rate. However, the reproductive rate is not the most influential demographic rate for these plants because they're extremely long-lived. So years with no fruit production will have a relatively small effect on the population because the adults are really long-lived and the population can easily make it through periods of low reproductive output. So we have to weigh this variance by the importance that survival versus fruit production has on population growth. And when we do that, when we integrate the trends in the means which represent that demographic compensation, changes in the variance as we approach the southern range limit, using structured population models like this projection matrix model where we have a vector of the population broken down into different size classes. We have the population matrix with fecundities, survival, regression, growth rates, all of those subscripted by t because we're going to allow them to vary year to year to project the population vector next year. When we do that with our data and ask, is there any difference in the stochastic population growth rate versus latitude? For the Distort, across 30 degrees of latitude, there's no significant difference in the stochastic population growth rate. So these demographic changes, compensation, seem to be maintaining a constant population growth rate across the entire range. For the Moss Campion, the different colors indicate significant difference in the growth rates, but it's certainly not the case that the southernmost population, closest to the range limit, have the lowest stochastic population growth rate. It's not the case that they have the lowest. The worst is actually the ones near Banff, which was a remarkably cold site compared to its latitude. So the conclusions are that these compensatory changes, these negative correlations between demographic rates, seem to be buffering the population growth rate over this large geographical range in North America. There's increasing variability, but it affects rates that have little impact on population growth, so they have only weak effects on population growth. And there's no evidence that the southern populations are doing worse, measured by the stochastic growth rate, than the northern populations at present. So it looks like right now we have a situation of range stasis, and we have some insight into the demographic mechanisms producing that stasis. However, we have two reasons to expect that that kind of stasis is not going to persist indefinitely. And one is if we look at the data a different way. So there's a lot of data on this slide, but what I've done here is simply taken, instead of the means of the demographic rates, I'm showing you the annual values. And these are all cases where there's some significant regression between the annual value of a demographic process and some measure of temperature on the x-axis. So always the y-axis is some measure of plant performance where Low values are poor performance, high values are good performance. It might be survival, it might be growth, it might be fruit production. And the x-axis is either mean July temperature or snow-free period. Two measures of temperature, because in a warmer year, the snow-free period is longer. Okay? And so each point is 1 year's data, and so we're actually looking at how these rates change with temperature in a year. What you see is a lot of curvilinear, significant quadratic relationships, which is what we would expect, right? That there's a thermal performance curve, there's an optimum temperature, and if the temperature is too low, they perform less well. If it's too high, they perform less well. It's not always true, but there's a lot of these inverted quadratic relationships. Secondly, if you look at the average range of temperature, it's either fairly flat, no response of this particular demographic rate, or there's opposing effects. So here they decline and here they increase. But as we push to warmer and warmer temperatures, you can see that some things continue to improve. This is the only one that seems to continue to improve as conditions warm. But all the other rates are now declining. So what that says is in the middle of this temperature range, we might see compensatory changes in demographic rates or flat responses. But if we push the system to greater and greater temperatures, we're going to reach the point where all these rates start to decline, and then the population growth rate will decline. Here's integrating all of those individual rates, survival, growth, fruit production, into a population growth rate as a function of temperature. And indeed, for all the populations, we eventually reach a point where population growth rate starts to decline as temperature increases. So the schematic picture is probably something like this. For modest increases in temperature, we might have some rates improving, some declining, some being relatively flat, and compensation is causing the population growth rate to be relatively flat. But we expect we're going to, from our yearly data, eventually reach a point where we reach a tipping point, where all the vital rates, or most of the vital rates, are declining, and therefore the population growth rate will decline. So what this says is that we shouldn't expect that because we see demographic compensation now that will last indefinitely, that eventually we might suddenly reach a point where populations begin to decline. The second reason to be cautious about the model, the conclusion that the range seems to be static at the moment, is in that approach we've looked at so far, we assumed that the tolerance to temperature was a species level trait, that local populations are not adapted to their local climate. If they are adapted to their local climate, then a little bit of warming in the north might have a strong negative effect there, as well as in the south. So with new postdoc Megan Peterson, we've started to look at local adaptation. You can see that she does not have the phenotypic effects of long-term study as we do, but she's relatively new to this project. And so what we did was we started with some common garden experiments in growth chambers, taking seeds from moss campion plants from the entire latitudinal range and growing them in a range of temperatures and asking, did they all perform equally well at the same temperature, or was there evidence of local adaptation to temperature? And here's the data. We actually did this experiment twice. So first we did the experiment from 1 to 19 degrees, and then we repeated it. We realized survival rates were still increasing, growth rates were still increasing. So we repeated the experiment at a greater range of temperatures up to 30 degrees C. And a few things that this shows. First of all, there's some optimum temperature in between these where survival reaches a maximum value and then declines. If you look at the warmer experiment, survival is declining as temperature goes up and growth is increasing. So in the growth chamber, we're seeing the demographic compensation within individual populations, negative or opposing responses to warming that we saw in the field populations. A second thing to note is a sort of counterintuitive result that the populations in blue are the ones from farther north. In both of the experiments, they were actually growing faster at warmer temperatures than populations from the south. And so one possibility is that they've actually been selected by having a very short growing period to grow as fast as they can given what the temperature allows. And this has been termed counter-gradient variation, that the variation in the growth rate is countering the gradient in environmental conditions in order to be a form of local adaptation that allows them to take advantage of shorter growing seasons in the north. And the last thing to say is if we try to estimate where the peaks of these curves are, the optimum temperature, and plotted against the temperature of the home site, the site where the seeds were obtained, we see a noisy but generally positive relationship that the seeds from the south are from warmer conditions and they have warmer optimum temperatures for survival and for growth. So this is a sign, a suggestion that there is local adaptation to the climate conditions from the locations they are from. So this is just summarizing what I just said. We have evidence of demographic compensation even at the scale of individual populations when we vary the temperature in growth chambers. The faster growth of northern populations may be an example of counter-gradient variation, and there seems to be evidence that the optimum temperature for growth corresponds to the actual historical temperature from the locations those seeds were found, that there is local adaptation. So if there's local adaptation, that really changes our tipping point picture. Instead of having this picture where we have sort of compensatory change here in the growth rate increasing as we approach the southern range limit, survival rate declining, and that all populations are following basically this same curve, but they're experiencing different temperatures, that would suggest that it's the southern populations that are closer to this tipping point where both rates are going to start to decline. If instead each population has demographic compensation but a different tipping point, so the northern population demographic compensation, but it's going to reach its tipping point at a lower temperature than populations further south, then all populations could reach the tipping point simultaneously due to global warming of temperature. In fact, as we all know, the predictions from the climate models are that warming will be greater in the north because of feedbacks with albedo and snow, that the climate models all predict higher rates of warming at northern latitudes. So that means that the northern populations may actually be closer to their tipping points, paradoxically, than the southern populations. So if that's true, then our sanguine prediction that demographic compensation is causing static range limits may not be true. So we're following up in a new LTREB, long-term research for environmental biology project, to look in more detail at this local adaptation. So we're going to be starting this summer, common garden experiments where we transplant seeds of the moss campion and the bulbils and roots of the distort across 30 degrees of latitude from New Mexico and Colorado into Alaska and then back. And we're going to draw those seeds and bulbils from plants we've been studying. So we know something about the response of the parent plant to historical variation in climate in our 20-year study. And we can get some insight into whether those responses are heritable by looking at how their offspring respond to climate variation when placed in very different places from where they were found. And our ultimate challenge is to be able to actually predict how populations of these species will change across the whole continent-wide range in North America, accounting for the fact that their responses to temperature may be different depending upon their position in the range due to local adaptation. And that's a big challenge. It involves things like estimating how much dispersal there is, and interpolating what the pattern of local adaptation is between sites where we've actually studied it. So there's a lot of challenges ahead, but that's where we're going. So I'm finishing now with this slide just to say that nothing that we do is very complicated. We just go back year after year to the same populations. We kneel, we measure seedlings, we measure plants. But I think there's a lot to be gained by doing the same kind of long-term demographic studies, particularly across the many populations of a widespread species, to get some insight into what sets range limits and how they will change as climate changes. Thank you. I left 4 minutes. So there doesn't seem to be any, I think what you might be asking is like, does the age or the size at first reproduction differ across latitudes? Yeah, they're growing faster in the south. Well, I'm not sure if I am answering your question, but they grow faster in the south, but so they reach the size at which they begin flowering sooner than they do in the north. The size at which they begin flowering seems to be fairly constant across latitudes. But that would mean a plant is reaching reproductive size sooner. It's less likely to, it doesn't have to survive as many years. It actually has a lower survival rate. That's the compensation. But the size at which they reproduce is actually about the same everywhere. And it's a long time. So in Alaska, we estimate these plants take about 25 years to begin flowering. And they live 200 to 300 years. So they're basically a tree. I mean, I showed you that taproot. If you think about a tree that you've shoved into the ground where what you see is the tips of the branches, that's what these plants really are, and they have the life history of a tree. Deborah? So we have looked at whether there's any trend in density across latitudes, and there is not. So there must be, but I think the way it happens is, so we've also looked at whether removing neighbors affects their growth and survival, and it has extremely minor effects, whether the neighbors are conspecifics or heterospecifics. Probably the way density dependence works in this population is the seeds don't disperse very far. Most of the small plants are right around the parent. There's only a few places. The challenge, I think, for a seed is to get your root down very quickly to where you're anchored below the frost heaving line. Because if you're a little plant with a little root system, next winter the frost is going to heave you out and you're dead. There's only probably a few places where that can occur. And once the parents are there in those places, all these offspring are basically toast until the parent dies, and then an offspring can take over that site. I'm sure that there is, not in the later vital rates. I think that's where it's happening, is that recruitment. We haven't had the heart to kill adult plants and see whether their offspring then recruit, because when we know they're 300 years old, we don't want to kill them.
So part of why I asked is because that could be a mechanism for the density concentration across populations. Is it, well, or over time, that is, if there are more plants, if there's increased mortality to fewer plants, then there might be
higher growth. But the growth chamber experiment argues against that entirely, because the densities were the same there, and yet we saw that pattern, which is convenient, because that is a very realistic concern.
How are they pollinated?
So
Does that vary across these sites?
the moss campion is insect pollinated. In fact, it's gynodioecious, so it has hermaphrodites that make very few seeds and females that are cytoplasmically male sterile and make more seeds, and they require pollen from the hermaphrodites. There seem to be mostly bumblebee pollinated across the range. That raises the possibility that biotic interactions changing with climate change could have effects on them. There's also the possibility that there are interactions with herbivores. The moss campion doesn't seem to have any herbivores. The Distort in the north particularly has this starchy root I mentioned that helps it to get through the winter, and voles will dig them up, and they are also seemingly long-lived. So voles killing the root, eating the root, and killing a plant could have strong demographic effects. And the voles in northern latitudes have this 3-year cycle, so you can see in some years they dig up a lot of plants. We haven't really looked at the demographic impact of them, of those biotic interactions.
Based on climate models, are you able to say whether it's going to be warming or variability in temperature that's going to have a more significant effect on that? That was question number one. Question number two, were you close enough to that grizzly bear to see that it actually uprooted it?
Can I do the second question first? Yes, I actually saw this grizzly. I was out on a hike and I saw this grizzly bear go up to this ridge, and I happened to go the same way. And there was this plant that obviously had just been, I didn't actually see it overturn it, but I saw the grizzly bear go over, and I inferred that he or she did it. My sense is that changes in the mean rates are probably more important than changes in the variability. As climate changes, changes in mean survival and growth are probably more important than changes in the variability. But you know, the challenge there is that my understanding from the climate modelers is they're more confident in the predictions about the future mean climate conditions than they are in the predictions about future variability. So we can try tying our predictions to those, but there will be less confidence in the predictions about changes in variability.
In the southern populations, they're very low rent. I'm curious if you looked at these factors throughout that particular population. You've got the latitude, you also have the altitude. So the demography of the plants, say, on the mountain top, relative to if you just go down a few hundred meters below, actually dies out. So it's actually being tail already in place. I mean, that's really business end right there. Do you see any difference between those two?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, this question comes up a lot. We've looked a little bit at, in the one place in Alaska where we've studied them across a bit of a latitudinal gradient, and not seen much of any consistent effect of altitude on demography. But all those populations are well above tree line. I think what's going to happen is in the south is, well, it depends on a lot of things. If the climate warms and it continues to be wet, very likely that trees will move up. They're basically perched on these little islands now, alpine islands. I mean, in New Mexico, they're at the very top of the very highest mountains in New Mexico. And not very much increase in tree line would wipe them out. So I think that, but that requires that if it gets warmer, it also stays wet so that trees can continue to move up. And so I'm not sure what's going to happen.
Side, right? There's the top three mountains. Is there any difference in demography between those here and at the actual altitude?
Not in the one place we've looked, but we haven't looked at that in all latitudes. In the south, for example, there's only 2 populations. They're about the same elevation. We had to study them where they were, so we can't really ask that. We're sort of stuck with the few remaining populations that there are, but it's an interesting question.
So there are two parts of my question. The first part is how do you measure the age of that?
We don't. So some people have tried to look for growth rings by sectioning, and it doesn't, it's, you know, they last for a while, but it's not a reliable way to age. So we infer the age from population models. So if you take the population model and ask, it's basically a Markov model, how long would it take a new seedling to reach the size of our largest size classes, accounting for survival and growth and reversion rates, the fact that they can shrink in size. And from that, you can infer how long it would take to get to be a large individual on average. And that's 200 to 300 years.
And the second part is so the northern thing, the survival rate is higher. So are they also older than in general than the
Well, the only way we would know that is by inferring through the projection matrix model. I would expect them to be substantially old because survival is higher and growth is slower. So to reach that large size will take more years.
Following on from Rudy's question, what about moisture? Is there enough year-to-year variation in summer rainfall or soil moisture that you can look to see if there are any impacts? That is also important.
Yeah, so we now have, for the last 5 years, we have hobo data loggers with soil moisture probes at every one of the populations. So we're recording soil moisture as well. And so we only have about 5 years at this point, which is not much to look at correlations. But yeah, we've done a little bit of that. And initially, we didn't see a signal in the first years. But I think we're certainly planning to look at that. And I think in the south, in particular, in Colorado and in Mexico, there's a real potential for the combination of very hot temperatures and low rainfall to be highly detrimental. So I think it's likely that at least there. In the north, in the North Slope, it's permafrost. So it's always wet. It's got ice just below the surface. So the impact of precipitation is likely to vary across the range, but could play a significant role in the south. Thank you.